Коллеги, добрый день.
Good afternoon, dear colleagues. We are starting the press conference by the Governor of the Bank of Russia, Elvira Nabiullina, and the Deputy Governor, Alexei Zabotkin. And we'll start with the statement by the Governor following the Board of Directors meeting. Good afternoon. Today we have made the decision to decrease the key rate by 50 basis points to 7.5% per annum. With the key rate at this level, we can say that our monetary policy is currently neutral. We see that one-off disinflationary factors are gradually weakening and pro-inflationary risks are growing. We believe that we now have less room for reducing the key rate. According to our forecast, inflation will slow down to 5 to 7% in 2023, considering the uneven influence of the structural transformation. Our monetary policy is aimed at returning annual inflation to 4% in 2024. I will now explain the reasons behind our today's decisions. First, annual inflation is slowing down, but the effect of disinflationary factors will be weakening further on. The main contributors to the price adjustment in summer were the earlier ruble strengthening, households' high propensity to save, and the expanded supply of agricultural products. These are largely one-off factors, and their impact will gradually be diminishing. Current price growth rates will exceed today's near-zero levels. That said, we do not rule out that annual inflation in the first 6 months of the next year might temporarily decrease below the target because of the high base effect. In other words, arithmetically, we can get a low rate comparing prices for consumer goods and services in March-April 2023 with prices in March-April 2022, when we observed soaring demand in the surge in prices. In this context, annual inflation will, like a rear-view mirror, reflect the situation of 2022. In addition to the factors accelerating inflation that I have already mentioned today, the current weak inflationary pressure is associated with the effects of the structural transformation of the economy. Earlier, we said that it was primarily speeding up inflation. Now we can see that the situation is more complex. The structural transformation might be accompanied with disinflationary pressures alike. In particular, the effects of the sanctions on exports and imports might be both pro-inflationary and disinflationary and change the direction over time. I would like to explain this in greater detail. Speaking of the sanctions on imports, their initial effect is certainly pro-inflationary as the economy faces a deficit of the sanctioned goods. However, later on, adjusting factors might arise. Firstly, there are alternative supply channels that are arranged, substituting products and so on. Progressive restoration of imports smooths the pro-inflationary effect. Secondly, when sanctions are imposed on a considerable share of imports, the demand for foreign currency inside the country declines and the ruble strengthens, which also causes an adjustment of the initial surge in prices. In the case of sanctions on exports, the original effect is, on the contrary, disinflationary. Exporters are looking for opportunities to make up for the lost external demand, including the expanding supplies to the domestic market, which puts downward pressure on prices. If sanctions result in a contraction of the inflow of export revenues to the country, this decline partially through the ruble depreciation weakens the initial disinflationary effect. Many companies will gradually find new external markets. This factor might both speed up as companies become more flexible in their pricing policy in the domestic market and slow down inflation. When the inflow of foreign currency revenues recovers, the exchange rate rises, which has a disinflationary effect. Summing up, we believe that the structural transformation of the economy will be accompanied with a faster rise in prices despite some short period of their adjustment. This is a critical factor that we consider forecasting inflation above the target next year and choosing our monetary policy approach. We have decreased the inflation forecast for this year to 11 to 13%. Making our decisions, we rely on the forecast rather than the current inflation trends. The estimate of steady inflationary pressure is of key importance over the forecast horizon. Steady means that inflationary pressure is adjusted for seasonal factors and the contribution of the most volatile components distorting inflation trends. Today, this estimate is low, but it is still above zero. I mean median core inflation and other indicators of inflation adjusted for volatile components. Further on, steady inflationary pressure might intensify slightly. Among other things, this might be driven by a decrease in households' propensity to save. Currently, people prefer to save rather than consume. This is largely explained by high uncertainty, a decline in real incomes, and concerns about future incomes and employment. However, this is partially associated with the so-called forced saving. People could save for large purchases or travel, but were forced not to go ahead with them, as a result of which the unused funds remained in their bank accounts. In inflation expectations staying elevated, this might shift this behavior model towards more active consumption. We are concerned about the fact that households' inflation expectations are still elevated and have even risen slightly, although the overall level of the prices has been decreasing for several months already. This was different over previous periods of inflation deceleration, for instance in 2019. In the situation in the economy evolves better than expected and people feel more confident in their future incomes and employment, this might also boost consumer activity. Second, the economic situation is better than expected in the economy. The GDP decline in the second quarter was close to our forecast. Moreover, there are signs that the situation is changing in a slightly most positive way in the third quarter, although it is still very uneven across sectors and regions. The situation in coal production, metallurgy, and forestry is more complicated, as the sanctions in these industries significantly hinder companies' operations. Goods exports to the West have seriously contracted or even become impossible in some cases, whereas goods sale to the East requires a considerable expansion of infrastructure. This will take time. Nonetheless, importers are adjusting to the changed situation with greater agility. Importers of domestic appliances and electronics have managed to restore supplies by refocusing on other manufacturers and using parallel import channels. Construction companies have also been able to arrange the supplies of many items, and most agricultural enterprises have managed to find new seed suppliers. More details on these issues are available in our regional economic review. I would briefly talk of the labour market. The situation here remains stable. In recent months, companies have been using part-time employment schemes slightly less frequently. The demand for labour remains steady, although its structure is changing. For instance, companies are importing new equipment due to which they need specialists who have completed retraining to work on this equipment. The structural transformation of the economy will inevitably cause a dismissal of employees where production becomes economically irrational, or a transfer of workforce to industries opening up new opportunities. This might translate into a temporary increase in structural unemployment. We will factor in all these trends in our updated forecast that we will present in October. The forecast of GDP for this year will most probably improve. Third, monetary conditions are currently neutral overall according to our assessment. The structure of household savings with banks is adjusting to the earlier changes in monetary conditions. In spring, the yield curve of federal government bonds was inverted, that is, short-term interest rates were higher than longer-term ones, whereas now the curve has normalized. Following this change, deposit rates have also adjusted, which has influenced the structure of household deposits. Specifically, the short-term deposits opened in spring at high interest rates have been transferred to current accounts and longer-term deposits. The structure of savings is thus returning to that observed last year. Businesses and households' demand for loans is increasing. After a pause in spring, corporate lending is expanding at a high pace. Although subsidized loans continue to play an essential role, market-based lending is becoming more important as it is getting more attractive owing to the considerable reduction of the key rate. Growth in retail lending is mostly driven by mortgage loans. Banks' risk appetite is recovering, which is also confirmed by a higher percentage of approved applications for unsecured loans. Overall, monetary conditions have neither a pro-inflationary nor a disinflationary effect at the moment. I would now dwell on the risks for the forecast. Disinflationary risks might manifest themselves predominantly in the short term. These risks might arise if the pass-through of the earlier ruble appreciation to prices becomes stronger, households' propensity to save remains at the current level or increases, and exports are redirected to the domestic market. As to the medium-term horizon, pro-inflationary risks still dominate. They include a contraction of foreign currency revenues due to the already announced sanctions. Geopolitical risks remain significant. A worsening of the situation in the world economy might have an additional negative impact. Consumer activity is a factor of high uncertainty. Elevated inflation expectations are not transforming into a rise in consumer demand at the moment. However, this might change, especially in the situation when inflation expectations are high and unanchored. The scenario where people start to spend their savings faster and take unsecured loans more actively is possible as well. There might arise additional supply-side problems. Today, we have not yet experienced all the consequences of the restrictions on investment goods imports, as the service life of equipment is quite long. Over time, these problems might become more pronounced. An essential issue for us is the budget. In recent months, budget expenditures have been growing very fast. This might also provoke pro-inflationary effects. I would like to focus on the mutual influence of monetary and fiscal policies. A budget deficit, along with credit to the economy, is a channel of money creation. The more money the economy receives through the fiscal channel, the less room there is for a balanced growth of credit to the economy. That is, the growth rate that will not provoke excess inflationary pressure. To contain the expansion of this credit for ensuring low and steady inflation, we will have to set a higher key rate. A long-term shift in fiscal policy towards easing means that the central bank will need to maintain a higher level of interest rates to ensure price stability. Therefore, the size of the structural deficit of the budget will influence our assessment of the neutral rate of interest. Now I would like to comment on monetary policy prospects. Most likely, the key rate reduction cycle is now close to its end. There are multiple signs suggesting that inflationary pressure is ceasing to weaken. In this context, we believe it reasonable to preserve a neutral monetary policy stance. Considering that the inflation forecast for the next year exceeds the target, we estimate the range of the shorter-run neutral rate above the range of the longer-run neutral rate, which is 5 to 6%. The monetary policy we pursue is aimed at returning inflation to 4% in 2024. Thank you for your attention. Thank you, colleagues. Your questions now, please. And don't forget to introduce yourselves and identify your agency in speaking to the microphone. Tatiana Chubasova, Interfax, first question. Can you please specify the signal point, because you said that the monetary policy easing cycle is coming to an end. Is there still a potential left to reduce the rate until the end of the year during the forthcoming board meetings? Will this cycle be coming to an end this year, or something may depend upon certain external or domestic conditions? And your inflation forecast was improved for this year, 11 to 13%. Can we say that it is going to identify itself more closer to the lower range boundary or not? Thank you. As far as the further interest rate trajectory is concerned, I shall repeat myself, we do think that the space for the rate to go down has narrowed. We will definitely be looking at the data points because one shouldn't rule out anything additional, but the probability of is going down is not as strong. And you correctly stated that it may depend upon the domestic and external factors. In October, we will come up with an updated forecast, and based on the then coming in data and an adjusted forecast, we will make our decision about the rate. Now, as far as assessing the inflation is concerned, at the rate at the level of 11 to 13%, that is the range. I think we're not able to tell you exactly where it is going to be exactly at which particular threshold. Thank you, Rita, please. Hello, Rita Shpilevskaya, TASS Agency. Our traditional question, what kind of decisions were on the table today, and did you consider the possibility of keeping the rate as it was? And my second question, more specific ones, you mentioned that in the first half of the next year, the inflation may go down below the target level. Within which particular months, if you could be more specific, please? Thank you. We considered three options of reducing it by 50 basis points, then by 25 basis points, and keeping it as it was. Now, with regard to reducing the annual inflation indicator below the target, that's basically because of the base effects, and we are seeing elevated price growth rate in April, and that could have been possibly through the spring months where we registered the lowest annual rate. But that I shall underscore an arithmetical effect, because we do expect that the current rates will pick up. Colleagues, yes, Delia, please. Thank you. Dilara Sonsonet, RIA Novosti. I have several questions to ask. The first one is about the signal, because you took out the signal from your statement. Does it mean that you're not going to publish it anymore? And my second question is about the budget. You mentioned budget and the budget expenditures, but based on what you're saying, by which margin the budget deficit should grow this year and next year in order for the central bank to start tightening its monetary policy. And my third question, I guess it's about you. Should one expect that maybe this year or next year you will again put on a pin on your lapel? Thank you very much. As far as the signal is concerned, no, we haven't taken it out. We took out the direction of that signal because we still keep the possibility, whenever possible, to issue more directed signals. But indeed, since we are getting close to the reduction cycle, we do allow for the possible next step, apart from keeping the rate, it could be bringing it up. But alongside with that, we don't rule out bringing it down, because at this point in time, we're going through the stage when many things depend upon the domestic and external factors and the way pro-inflationary and disinflationary risks may materialize. As far as the budget expenditure is concerned, we're not giving you the kind of an assessment in terms of what kind of budget deficit we need. We do take into account the fiscal policy and monetary policy and the decisions we make within the monetary policy specifically, but in order we could avoid, I shall put it this way, the need to raise the rate and tightening the monetary policy, we feel that the budget deficit should go down, because we're very well aware that in a crisis period the budget deficit grows and one should fund many expenditures of an anti-crisis nature, as well as structural resorting of the economy. But nevertheless, we do expect that the budget deficit ought to longer term decrease. As far as the pin on my lapel is concerned, in the meantime, I do not see any reason to put it on again. Would you like to add something about the budget? Well, maybe the only thing is that currently the base forecast, the July one, in terms of the update that we were doing in our working order, that anticipates the kind of the budget policy indicators that have been indicated in the main directives of the budget policy that the Minister of Finance presented in June, if you may recall. So if the budget that ultimately submitted to the Russian Parliament is going to be materially different from from this, that would constitute a significant factor, which, along with other ones, is going to be taken into account when forecasting the rate trajectory for next year. Yes, I would like to underscore that the budget is an important factor, and its significance is really material, but that is not the only one, and so we're going to make up our mind based on the aggregation of all of the factors which may affect the economy and inflation. Dear colleagues, please, Dmitry in the last row. Dmitry Butenko, Kommersant. The August-September inflationary expectations rise seemingly doesn't have any evident explanations. That is why, despite the fact that the central bank is not able to forecast inflation expectations, what's your hypothesis? How it should behave itself in October, December? Well, the first thing that I would like to respond with is that during summer months, our inflation expectations do stay within the 10.5 to 12.5% range, but we definitely are concerned by the fact that the current inflation expectations remain high, despite the decrease in its current price dynamics, because usually against such a long-run price reduction on a monthly basis, there would be a more express reduction of the inflation expectations, but we're not making any hypotheses in terms of how it would demonstrate itself. There are many factors currently impacting inflation expectations, particularly sensitive to the exchange rate, and that is remaining. Now, in terms of other factors, well, we're going to account for the data that we almost monthly receiving in terms of the inflation expectations. And I also would like to emphasize that not only inflation expectations amongst the households stopped going down, but also the price expectations of businesses in our reviews and surveys. And we monitor and read it as an indication of the fact that the businesses and households are feeling quite a big uncertainty towards the general economic situation, which translates itself into a high inflation expectations. And that is something that we definitely have to take into account when we define the nominal rate, because the difference between our nominal and inflationary indications does affect households' behavior. Andrei Ostro, Reuters. Could you please say what are the possible options in terms of resuming currency acquisitions that you are considering soon? And when do you think there would be clarity in the fiscal rule? What kind of currencies there will be purchased by the central bank and in which amounts? The restart of the currency purchases is only possible in the mirror-like response to the fiscal rule, as long as the fiscal rule will provide for the transactions by the national welfare fund in the currency market. And so the kind of the fiscal rule that is going to be introduced is currently being debated with the government, and so we hope that there will be more clarity with regard to it shortly. We do support the introduction of the fiscal rule from the point of view of creating conditions for macroeconomic stability. Yes, please, Alexei Borisovich. And I would like to remind us that the fiscal rule is not about buying currency, but about buying currency in case the oil and gas revenues exceed the base level. If they're below it, then currency is being sold as part of the fiscal rule. Colleagues, the next question comes from the city of Archangels. Andrei Murashov, the Northern Truth publication. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for the opportunity to ask a question. It may sound a bit local, but for our region, it is quite an important topic. The fact of the matter is that the forestry businesses have been confronted by difficulties, first and foremost by changing the destination of their products, and that brings about difficulties in transportation and some negative impact upon export revenues coming from the ruble appreciations. Could you please tell us, will the monetary policy by the Bank of Russia, specifically within sanctions, be able to support the industry, which is both important for the region of Archangels, but also for other Russian regions who are running the same kind of businesses. Thank you very much for your question. And in my presentation, I already mentioned that the forestry industry indeed turned out to be in a predicament because in many ways that industry has been export-oriented, dependent upon the external demand, which has suffered. But the situation in this industry specifically demonstrates why the structural reorganization of economy is important. If some products find new markets, definitely that will happen. Some won't, and so we need to think about it and about the way the forestry should reorganize itself and increase the level of added value processing so that more products could be marketed domestically. And we do understand that for such a reorganization, we need an investment loan and we need long money at affordable rates. And that directly depends upon inflation. Low, stable inflation, in the first place, is the instrument to make long-term loans available. As I mentioned multiple times, the key rate impacts the cost of the short money, whilst the long-term money are impacted by inflation, and our monetary policy specifically aimed at achieving a stable, low level of inflation. And that will help to increase long-term investment lending for the economy, which is passing through the structural transformation. But while the rates stay high, well, definitely the government may come to aid with its industrial policy measures through various capital grants and subsidies. But that is the prerogative of the government in terms of which industries and in which forms and at which scale support is to be made available. Yes, colleagues, please. Sasha. Alexander Wald, Life and Invest publication. My question is about the retail investors, which is quite a painful topic these days because on multiple occasions we heard that the trust of the retail investor should be re-established. And so it is very interesting to find out what are the measures intended in order to recoup this trust. And my second question is the exchange rate. It is a floating right now, but is there a chance that we will be back to a targeted one? And are there any risks that there might be any limitations or restrictions about the free conversion from the friendly countries? And my third question is also related to different investments, because non-qualified investors won't be able to gain access to buy stock of the unfriendly countries' issues, but at the same time they would be able to buy stock from the Russian management companies and shared funds. Why the central bank introduced such a restriction, making other things possible against the fact that the structural risks within them are the same, if not stronger? Thank you. I will begin by answering about the exchange rate course. What we act upon is that a floating exchange rate is better than a fixed one, although the debate is still going on about it. I shall repeat our arguments because I believe them to be very important. A floating exchange rate is the possibility to pursue an independent monetary policy, because what the fixed exchange rate means, it's the kind of exchange rate which is dependent upon the economic policy, dependent upon the stability of inflation, upon the interest rates of the country which issues currency, which may have ruble pegged to it as our national currency. And by the way, lately we've seen an acceleration in inflation in those countries who are the countries issuing reserve currencies, and the price growth came to a stop here in many ways thanks to the floating exchange rate. And nevertheless, with a floating rate, the economy is able to fast adjust itself to external changes, and our external conditions have changed dramatically, and that has impacted different sectors differently. And a floating rate allows to take into account this diversity of the way external conditions impact different sectors. This is a common denominator of sorts. Of course, on the one hand, the price one pays for this quick adjustment may be seen a higher volatility of the exchange rate in times of dramatic changes in external conditions, something that we went through. But there is also a prize to win, a more stable balance, a quicker adjustment of the economy, and a lower inflation once the economy ceases to adjust itself to these external conditions. And certainly, what's important here, in order to talk about greater predictability and stability in the real exchange rate, the fiscal rule is important. But the fiscal rule that has been in place over the past few years indeed enabled us to achieve better stability. And that was an indirect effect, but greater stability in the real exchange rate. As far as the free currency conversion is concerned, well, yes, indeed, the currencies that we've grown used to, the reserve currencies, US dollar and euro, for many holders, became toxic, that is to say, because risks emerge of a freeze being put on them in the countries that we mean don't want us to use their currencies actively. So we certainly do see that the banks want to diminish these risks and all these fees that have been discussed heatedly. In many ways, that is related to it. But to change hard currency for rubles or currency for rubles would always remain possible. As they say, there's a free rule working here as far as non-qualified investors are concerned, and availability to them to trade in foreign securities, including the mutual funds. Yes, indeed, within the mutual fund stocks, the non-qualified investors are available, can trade in them, but not all mutual funds are accessible by them, but specifically the ones where there are no more than 40% of complex kind of instruments. So from this viewpoint, the structure of such mutual funds is very possible. And most importantly is that these are the professionals who manage the mutual funds, the ones who can monitor, trace the risks, including what we describe as infrastructure risks, meaning by investing into various foreign securities. These risks definitely must be taken into account, and the decisions they make should be the best one for their clients. In case the above-mentioned principles are infringed, they carry fiduciary liability. And mutual funds, this is collective investments, and that helps to diversify risks, amongst other things, compared to investing into the security issued by one issuer. When somebody buys paper from one foreign company, so that's a single-born risk, and so mutual funds is a greater diversification of possible investment instruments, because even if risks materialize within one kind of securities, they can be compensated for through a positive dynamics in other instruments. So it's a bit of a differentiated approach. Would you like to add something? Thank you. Colleagues, Rita, please. Margarita Mordovina, RBK. I also have a partial question about investors to further extend on Alexander's question. During the Moscow's Minister of Finance conference, you stated that there is a possibility being considered to create a fund out of which some of the investor money can be compensated. Does the central bank has any assessment how much of non-resident money held is currently frozen, and into which assets this money can be invested? And my second questions following yesterday's events about sanctions. Does the central bank currently see any dramatic stoppage of the Mir cards being processed abroad, specifically in Turkey? And have you held a dialogue with the Turkish regulator about it, as well as with the regulators in other countries? Thank you. Well, the idea behind setting up a compensation fund using the deposit insurance company is currently being debated because it contains a lot of issues, a lot of details. The basic target behind this idea, because we're ready to consider other ideas as well, and do our best to try and return the investors' trust in the retail market. That is about the question that you raised. Freezing these investments always leads to trust suffering. We spoke about using the C account funds. That is where several hundreds of billions of rubles have been accumulated, but the funds on the C kind of accounts may continue to grow. And we're talking not about using these particular funds because the amount of non-resident entitlements and rights remains, although frozen, because we talk about reinvesting the income from these funds, because we talk about not the banks keeping it, but to channel it towards compensating the people who ended up in a situation when their assets have been frozen. Now, principally, there is a broad class of assets, and investing these funds will definitely create income, and such income may turn in terms of its nature, depending upon how the financial market evolves. But nevertheless, this is the kind of a resource which can be utilized. Once again, we are still in the process of discussing it with the colleagues from various government agencies and the financial market players, as well as the investor representatives, about the better form to do it. Now, with respect to the MIR card, we are working with quite a few regulators and jurisdictions in order to expand the geography where the card can be accepted. We definitely encounter difficulties. You mentioned specifically Turkey, when the banks in such countries are naturally trying to minimize their sanctional risks, the risks of the secondary sanctions, and so we encounter such problems, particularly with the cards issued by the sanctioned banks. But this is an everyday work. We continue to do this job. Next question comes from Denis Yalachowski from Funny Money Agency, please. Good afternoon. I would like to continue the topic of investors. The central bank couldn't but hear this loud cry from investors about the Gazprom's shares on the eve of the board of directors publication about the dividend decision. It was difficult to explain to investors what was the reason, apart from the insider trading. What kind of measures central bank is thinking to undertake to counter the insider trading in Russia? My second question about the possible changes in the ruble exchange rate because of the import recovery and the decrease in the export revenue. Well, what kind of measures the central bank may undertake in case the trading balance changes, and specifically has the central bank considered the possibility to reconsider the current limitation placed upon taking the individual owner's currency savings outside of the country? And the third question about the cryptocurrency, the Prime Minister involving the Bank of Russia and Minister of Finance suggested that one should switch to a compromise by using cryptocurrencies. What is the probability of the central bank easing its approach to using cryptocurrencies and to make this industry a more liberalized one, at least by the end of the year? Thank you. Thank you. With regard to a first question, basically about the insider trading countermeasures related to a possible insider trading at an exchange platform. What we stem from is that the exchange price is one of the most transparent mechanisms of pricing, and so faith in pricing processes through the exchange is very important in terms of investor trust, because we talk a lot about trust from investors. We indeed have to revive it, and the fairness of the exchange-based pricing is the key element in this. We, as the regulator, detect intentional violations, market manipulation or insider trading, continuously monitoring the exchange trading process in order to identify such anomalies in pricing. If such an anomaly is detected, we start getting to grips with it. What was the reason? What were the conditions behind it? Whether there was any reason to believe that there was a manipulation or insider trading. Once we establish such reasons, we go into a detailed investigation, the process which takes some time. It is not a public process. But before and until the point in time when the results are firm, because that might impact the business reputation of the entities that we investigate. But if the fact of manipulation or an insider trading are confirmed, this is the information which we definitely disclose. And here we act practically as most of the regulators in other countries. This work has been going on for several years. Throughout the time that we've been busy with it, we established 126 cases of manipulation and 6 cases of unlawful use of insider information. One should say that in the beginning of September, there was a very hard work that we were doing, and so the first criminal ruling was passed in the beginning of September. In as far as the insider trading was concerned, we are resolute in identifying all of the facts in very close cooperation with the law enforcement, because the legal administration in this particular area in this country hasn't yet reached a perfect state. So that was, one may say, the first successful case. Now, and as far as the exchange rate is concerned, there is a better impact on the exchange rate coming from the import-export dynamics, to a lesser extent the financial account processes, and a lot will depend upon the way the trends may take shape themselves up in exports and imports, because there is still a lot of external restrictions, and that is what we take into account in our monetary policy. And specifically speaking, the foreign trade dynamics is one of the factors that we are being very mindful of. Mrs. Sutton will add something now. As far as cryptocurrency is concerned, our position, we are ready to discuss the ways and means to use the digital financial assets and cryptocurrency for international settlements. But at the same time, we continue to stand against cryptocurrencies being used as the means for payment and for free circulation in the country. We continue having a discussion about it with the government, but in our mind, in terms of there being a big potential for international settlements, something that one may find in the cryptocurrencies issued by central banks. But as far as the digital financial assets are concerned, we have a legislation covering it. And in as far as the digital financial assets do not are not expected to be used as the money surrogate, we believe that this should basically simplify the process of issuing such digital financial asset. In terms of the main principles, we continue to discuss this with the government. Colleagues, please. Good afternoon, Julia Kuznetsova, investment advisor in the Central Bank registry. First of all, I would like to thank you for the opportunity to ask you a question personally in terms of the cryptocurrency. Yesterday, during the press conference, the crypto ruble was presented. Now, my question is, how does the Central Bank consider the further introduction of the digital ruble? Will that continue throughout 2023? Will we witness the transactions using the digital ruble? That was my first question. And my second question, if I may, is about gold currency reserves, which were frozen. I mean, the Russian ones. And does central bank currently have any plan about how to bring it back into the country? And my third question is about the retail investor trust and the investment advisors. To what extent it would be possible for an investor advisor, for a retail investor, to continue working and to promote investment advisor as a profession, as a possible way about it? The director of the AMIC company suggested, Fanny Safiullin, in one of the ways is to give a recommendation to an investment advisor who is not a qualified investor in terms of purchasing a security which a qualified investor may acquire. That is a bit of a complicated wording, and using this opportunity, I would like to thank you for doing so much in these difficult times. That is really highly appreciated to make such serious and difficult decisions. Thank you for these warm-hearted words. As far as the digital ruble is concerned, we are are actively working over this project, which we deem to be extremely important to develop our financial system and our settlement system. Currently, we are testing the digital ruble with 15 banks. This is a bit of a testing mode about how one can open purses on the digital ruble platform, how one can do transfers between individuals, how can do payment for goods and services using QR coding. But as far as real customers are concerned, we are planning to start doing testing on a limited basis sometime from April 1st next year. There are so many issues about technology, and it is very important for people to have good faith in this digital ruble system, cybersecurity, so that it could be seamless and comfortable. As far as golden currency reserves are concerned, the prospect is litigation, but that is really a very lengthy process. We are preparing ourselves, we are researching it, what is best to be done. As far as investment advisors are concerned, it is true that investment advisors do represent an important part of the financial market as such, and may help for investor trust to the financial market to grow. But the way you pose it for an investment advisor to give recommendation to a non-qualified investor to buy the kind of securities that have not been allowed that they would buy then, like they were qualified investors, we are quite restrained about it, because an investment advisor these days takes on the risks giving such an advice, because this is still a human being. And secondly, a certain time may pass between an advice given and the way the transaction actually takes place, because certain conditions may change, and the ultimate customer takes on the risks and suffers losses, because we believe that there needs to be an additional change put into the legislation in order to expand the authority for and discretion for an investment advisor to clearly set the boundaries for the liability. It is quite formal right now. For example, there is no requirement placed upon the investment advisor in terms of what kind of asset they should put into such a transaction. Even if a non-qualified investor may prove that the risks suffered or the losses suffered were because of such an advice, but there is no way to compensate for such losses incurred. And the investment advisor profession itself must be further developing. Some of my colleagues are saying that they are looking at the way this particular sector is developing. For example, many investment advisors offer training programs, training software. That is quite good, but in big font, it states that the investment advisors are in the central bank registry, and very small font, they used to say that the investment advisor cannot be held liable for the advice given. So it all has to be brought into some sort of a balanced form. Next question comes online. Julia Mizonova, senior editor of abakan.ru portal. Good afternoon. Julia Mizonova, Republic of Khakassia. Because of the reduction of the rate, the accounts held in the bank can lose attraction, but non-qualified investors don't have much to invest into the exchange, because the brokers and different pyramids really have inundated the internet, using the low level of literacy amongst the citizens. So where people with money can take it to? Yes, it's a very frequent question, where to invest. Regrettably, there are no universal solutions. For every individual, it depends upon individual situation, upon the income, upon the amount of funds saved that people can afford to invest. Everybody has his or her individual propensity to risk. It's all very individual, but bank deposits is the most, I guess, conservative way to preserve one's resources. Yes, deposit rates usually don't exceed inflation. However, there is a system of insurance which completely excludes the loss of savings within a certain amount. Currently, we have it at 1,400,000. At the same time, there are different ways to invest, depending upon whether you are a qualified or a non-qualified investor. For example, non-qualified investors now have available to them the majority of the Russian-issued instruments at an exchange, because we see that many Russian companies and big companies are coming out with offerings, and the limitation that we introduced specifically to protect non-qualified investors from risk, because the stock market instruments, by definition, carry certain risks within themselves. For example, that makes them different from a deposit where a certain amount is fully insured. And so when foreign securities are being bought, investors must understand that they have a risk of a foreign jurisdiction. If something happens to such a security, you will have to litigate in a foreign jurisdiction. And so the domestic regulator won't be able to help you. So people have to make their decisions based on such a risk. The qualified investors are believed to be the one who are able to assess such a risk, and henceforth they have more instruments available to them. As far as pyramids are concerned, you mentioned this word. It is true that fraud in the financial market is there. That is what we're trying to fight through different means, including against such pyramids. We're working with the law enforcement authorities, trying to detect them, as well as the illegal financial players who raise private citizens' money. So we have prepared a draft law. I mean, the Federation Council, the upper chamber of the Russian parliament, has prepared a draft law according to which the money of individuals can be raised, can be taken only by legal entities containing a specific legal status, so that the illegal fundraising from the citizens could be nipped in the bud, rather than only when it finds out that there is a fraudulent scheme already creating detriment. Thank you. Next one, Olga, please. Good afternoon. Olga, Finance. And my question is more on behalf of the greater audience, because right now, considering the subsidized mortgage rates, we see the rates at the level of 3%. But again, only for the exempt categories of citizens. And these rates are able to hold because of the government support measures. But because you forecast inflation at about 4% by 2024, how realistic it is to see such rate close to 3% for a broader circle of the Russian people? Such subsidized rates may only take place within the subsidized program, because if you talk about a market-based rate, roughly speaking, the mortgage rate cannot be lower than within the long-term government bonds in terms of how the government borrows money, because that is the most risk-free investment for banks. And that is why rates can only be higher in a mortgage area if they're not subsidized better than the bond rates. And against the 4% inflation, such a rate definitely won't be lower than 6% as a minimum. Now, a subsidized rate, it can be a local one, like in the Far East, like a temporary anti-crisis measure. Many currently may observe that there are very low rates, even close to zero. I mean, the developer's mortgage offering. But I would like to warn you, this is just simply a marketing ruse, often related to the fact that people buy a real estate at an elevated price. And through that elevated price, a developer is able to have this one-off compensation and pass it on through the banks. And we're going to undertake measures against it, because it's in many ways is misleading borrowers. But overall, the reduction of inflation and a stable nature of such a thing makes mortgage funding more affordable. We've already noticed, like during the previous period, when we had a stable inflation, mortgage, even without subsidized programs, was becoming more and more available to a much broader circle of people. Maybe additional context to that explanation. It was just yesterday that in the United States, the 30-year mortgage rate went above 6% for the first time since 2008, against the fact that the inflationary expectations there against the accelerated inflation are much lower. This is just as a marker, and generally speaking, the mortgage rate usually is 100, 150 basis points above the level of the government bond yields with 7 to 10 years maturity. Next question comes from Evgenia Pismenaya, Bloomberg. The first question. In what way stopping the supply of gas through the Nord Stream affected the payment balance growth for this and next year? When are you going to further specify your forecast in October? Will you be taking into account the current status of supplies into it? Second question. The Bank of Russia is preparing to allow opening the foreign banks affiliates in Russia. At what stage this issue currently is? In what way the central bank will regulate such affiliates? Will they be able to take the households and businesses deposit, and how that may impact competition with the local banks? And are there any willing banks to do this? Quite a few questions. As far as assessing the impact from the supply of gas through the Nord Stream, we don't make any quantitative estimates into the fact of what may happen within this or that supply route of applying to this or that resource. But at the same time, we take into account elevated risks, restrictions of different natures and measures which may limit the supplies of natural resources out of Russia, and that is reflected in some quite conservative approaches to assessing revenues from the oil and gas sector. It is very important here to understand that we're talking about specifically revenues from the oil and gas sector, because there are two things there: price and volumes, because the price may be higher, volumes lower, and the other way around. That is what we take into account. Without doubt, that is one of the most important factors in our forecast, but once again, I shall underscore that we entertain a very conservative approach here when preparing our base forecast. And naturally, in October, we shall further update our forecast estimates based on the coming data. As far as opening the foreign banks affiliates is concerned, this is the topic which is currently being debated. It's too premature. It's very preliminary right now. I'm not in a position to answer many questions about it, but indeed, if it would be necessary to allow the possibility for foreign banks to open up affiliates, because I shall remind you, we have such a possibility with respect to the foreign insurance companies, according to our WTO conditions. So if one is to allow foreign banks to open up affiliates, the question is, how are we to regulate their operations so that there's no regulatory arbitrage coming out of it, and in terms of what kind of transactions such an affiliate should be legally allowed to perform. So that is subject to discussion. Now, are there anybody willing to? Yes, we hear this question from many. I mean, at least some are asking us a question if a bank affiliate can be opened in Russia. Dear colleagues, Anna Lazareva, please. Good afternoon, Anna Lazareva, Russia 24. My first question about the federal budget. Based on the government estimate, it is going to be quite a complex one now in terms of the central bank's view. What are the most problematic points in it? Another question, this year, the mortgage market shall celebrate 25th anniversary. How do you assess the availability, transparency, and safety of the mortgage market? Well, as far as the budget is concerned, Yeah, it is difficult to maintain macroeconomic stability and at the same time undertake budgetary expenditures required for the structural reorganization of the economy. So we need to establish a balance. From the point of view of the central bank, the key issue, of course, is the level, not really level, but in 2023 of the budget deficit, because once again, I shall repeat that we understand the kind of conditions within which the temporary budget deficit may grow in order to fund anti-crisis measures and the necessary spending in order to support the structural economic changes. But the support of the budget deficit is necessary, and what they describe as the normalization of the budget policy. Why is it important? Because the level of this budget structural deficit directly impacts our view of the long-term level of the real neutral rate. We possibly may have paid less attention in the past to it because there was a fiscal rule in place, but it is very important to understand what kind of the fiscal rule will be now, what kind of transition towards it there will be, and longer term, what kind of structural deficit may play out. Once again, the assessment of the long-term neutral rate is dependent upon it, and likewise our forecast of the key rate. Would you like to add something, Alexei Borisovich? Nothing for me to add. All of these things are quite important. And as far as the mortgage instrument is concerned, I do recall the very start of the discussion of the mortgage, because many used to say that, no, the mortgage market in Russia won't grow roots, this is not our national instrument. But we now see that it is very much sought after. For many people, this is a good way to solve their housing problems. And, of course, affordable mortgage market is very important, for which there should be a low inflation. Against a low inflation, the interest rates with respect to the long-term loans becomes more affordable. But you've got to be really scrutinizing mortgage processes so that, God forbid, there wouldn't be any prerequisites playing out for mortgage market bubbles and crises. We're very watchful over it. We do apply our measures. We have a tool set which we may apply to the banks. So that is what we describe as macroprudential measures, through which we may restrict the bank's ability to mortgage land to the borrowers who are over-securitized, overburdened with debt. The market, it is very important for the market like this to develop in a very balanced way so as to avoid systemic risks or risks for individuals who are not in a position to clearly and correctly assess their future. So as I was saying, we've got different marketing ruses that we see that mislead the borrowers, but the overall assessment, there is a positive effect of the way the mortgage market is developing. It is difficult to argue against that. Would you like to add something, Alexei Borisovich? No, you've mentioned everything already. All right. Our next question comes from a blogger from South Sakhalin city, Svetlana Nigmatulmina. The number of Russians who run the risk of being unemployed is growing. That is evident, and the President of Russia mentioned it. Based on the recent official data, almost 234,000 people are not working or are on furloughs. Is the banking system ready to protect itself from such problems, and won't the banks impose penalties upon individuals who no longer have a steady income? Well, the current situation in the labor market is quite stable, but definitely we ought to take into account different risks, and the banks do take into account such eventualities when they lend to individuals. They create a respective impairment. We are monitoring such impairment level, because whenever there is a difficult situation, so that the bank wouldn't lose its capital, so as to remain in its ability to lend. And the second thing, the two last crises demonstrated that the banks are quite willing to restructure loans when they become aware that borrowers temporarily lose employment or will lose employment, and so they give a bit of the time to breathe freely. In many ways, the banks initiate such restructuring themselves, understanding that both for the borrowers as well as for the banks themselves, it is important to undertake such restructuring. Apart from it, as I mentioned when I spoke about the mortgage market, also in view of the consumer loans, we have special regulating norms which restrict banks in lending to borrowers who are overburdened with debt because they have the scoring systems, and so the banks have learned to control risks. They have enough resilience in this sense, and so we do not observe any material negative effects from any possibility of this becoming a negative situation. Ina Aldoshina, Front Media, and I would like to go back to the topic of the frozen assets and the compensation fund and the possibility for it to be established, which is going to be established out of revenues from reinvesting the funds from the sea accounts. As far as I understand, to generate such an income, you need to get these funds to manage rather than simply just sequestering it. So upon which grounds and which entity is going to gain access to such funds? As far as I understand, currently, one ought to prepare a certain legal framework or introduce amendments into the existing legislation. Additionally, non-residents with their rubles on the sea kind accounts, although little, but at least they may enjoy some sort of activity or at least expand their investment into the government bonds. And I don't know how that is going to be shared. Maybe the full amount of the frozen assets is going to be used or just a part of it. Also, from what I understand from your words, the list of instruments available, not only the bank deposit, but also some exchange-based instruments, if I understood correctly. I'm not afraid that the very same non-residents would like to increase the sanctional pressure upon us through that. And do I understand correctly that the compensation fund it is where a human being, an investor, will be receiving money in exchange for a part of the frozen assets? Or is it going to be paid on top of what is currently being frozen? Or is frozen? And like you've previously stated, in the market, there are other ideas right now being considered of how to help investors, and one of them is a possible exchange swap, a swap between the assets between the foreign and domestic investors. Some are suggesting that all for everything. Others are talking about swapping using certain instruments. Now, is it correct to understand that the idea that you described is something that you assess being more realistic than what I've just described, or am I mistaken? Another question about the topic of the frozen assets and frozen hopes. If one can imagine that through some sort of wonder, the central bank will be able to come to an agreement with the central European regulators and get an approval to get an exchange of assets with Raiffeisen, the central bank as a regulator and as a participant of the professional board, will it approve such a deal? Thank you. With respect to your last question, no, we're not commenting on any specific transactions or dealings between the financial marketplace. As far as compensation funds are concerned, we're not talking about sequestering any investor funds. We're talking about income generated by investing such funds. I mean, the funds of non-friendly residents are frozen, but they are being invested and they generate income. And this income is not being credited to the investor accounts. It can be used to compensate for the lost income that our domestic investors are suffering from because of their foreign frozen assets. But in order for such mechanisms to work, you need to have a legal framework. You're absolutely correct, and that is really worth discussing. In the meantime, we are talking about the funds which have been accumulated on the non-resident held accounts. And I don't think this is in the way for using the right to buy the government bonds available, because we're not talking about putting a total freeze on them. I mean, this money is being invested. It just stays in the banking system. What we're saying is that they should be used in order to pay out to mass investor, because out of the income that one may generate out of the so far accumulated sea-held funds is not going to be enough for everyone. And so you have to identify a certain rota and start from a mass investor. Well, asset swap is something that one should also discuss as an idea. We're not relinquishing it. You have to weigh all the pros and contras. But whenever we're talking about swapping these assets for the funds or assets frozen on the sea accounts, these are simply incomparable values. And so how one should define the fairness in this. So with the idea behind the deposit insurance company compensation, I believe that the mass investor, with regard to small amounts, that one may release through this approach. Different mechanisms are currently being debated, whether it should be a certain, well, I mean, to say that we're open to discuss this with investors, because we want to help the investors who ended up in this difficulty and use all available resources in our hands. Next questions come from a blogger, Zen Channel. You won't deceive me. Natalia Holezova from the Nizhny Novgorod. Considering the August results, the lending to the Russians exceeded 1 trillion rubles. Does it mean that it's overly too much? And now, can we talk about the growing lending? Will it help the national economy? Well, first of all, consumer lending has just about started recovering after it plummeted in spring, and we do see how it is really picking up. But we believe that, speaking about the rates of growth, that remains moderate within our base forecast. And although 1 trillion sounds like a big figure, we're talking about issued loans from the beginning of the year. Now, if you are to assess the effect of this lending pace upon the economy, it would be more correct to talk not about lending, but about the changing lending portfolio, because apart from lending, there is also repayment. And the money which is being used to repay loans, that doesn't increase the demand in the economy. So you've got to assess this delta. So speaking about growth of the lending portfolio itself, sometime in August, it became 10% more than in July, but 1.5% lower than in August last year. In the meantime, yes, lending is recovering once again, I'm saying, but at a moderate pace. At the same time, the lion's share of loans is in mortgage sector, long-term loans here at comparatively low rates. They are. And that doesn't create a big burden in terms of monthly payments that households have to maintain. We have, as I said, regulating instruments which restrict banks in their lending to overly credited individuals. As far as the way the consumer lending helps economy, well, here one should look into it through the monetary policy and the monetary conditions. Because if lending grows and simultaneously product supply grows, that does support the economy. If product supply cannot grow, because, amongst other things, different import restrictions and logistics, that simply transforms into price growth. So in our monetary policy, we do take into account and we do monitor the lending pace and the way the monetary aggregates grow and how it all transforms into the possibility to activate lending more. Dear colleagues, I see that there are so many questions coming, but our time is slowly coming to an end. Sergey, please. Bolotov Sergey, Ura RU. If I may, another question about the exchange rate. because over the past few months, the oil prices have been going down, the budget revenues have been going down, but the dollar has been growing in exchange to a prevalent majority of the world currency. With the dollar remaining at about 60, it essentially appreciates as opposed to other global currencies. Could you explain why is this happening, and do you believe that is in the interests of the Russian economy? Thank you. In the interest of the Russian economy, as I said, I explained that because it's a floating range that really equals it, because it takes into account all of the trends in imports and exports, and the exchange rate depends upon the payment balance, because recently it has been more or less stable after a dramatic weakening and then strengthening. Yes, there is a bit of a volatility, but overall it is stable, and I would ask Alexei Borisovich to also comment. Well, I mean, to be very specific, I should say that the lower point of appreciation was registered in June, locally towards the end of the month. You remember it was close to 50. Currently, as you mentioned, it is at about 60. That is a bit of a depreciation which correlates to the decline in the oil price, which has been occurring since June until this point in time. But at the same time, the exchange rate is being impacted not only by the oil price, but also by other things, specifically by the oil export volumes, as well as refined product export volumes, as well as in other product groups, as well as what happens in the import area. So whatever we are observing is a resulting impact from all of the things comprising the trading balance and the exchange rate dynamics, like Mrs. Nabiullina told us, like the governor told us. The exchange rate reflects the current economic realities, and a stronger exchange rate is something that definitely both the households are better off from it, the ones that are able to enjoy more affordable import products, as well as the businesses are better off who have to buy imported equipment and are able to compensate for the growth of the imported prices because of more expensive logistics. And that is exactly why we are really relying upon the floating exchange rate, which ensures the balance of interests of all of the economic players based upon their business modeling and requirements. Thank you very much indeed, colleagues. This is the last question. Mikhail, in the last row, please. Good afternoon, Mikhail Kuznetsov, Vedomosti. I've got a very quick question based on our estimates. So there is about a middle of the process that we're passing through in terms of your Discovery Bank assessments, how it is going on, and have you already identified the fair market price? We are in the process, and the evaluation process should come to an end in the middle of October. That is why, even in terms of preliminary estimates, it is not possible to give it to you. We will need to wait until the middle of October. So far, we hope towards the end of the year, in terms of the way the legislative framework is playing out, we will be able to close that deal. Colleagues, thank you very much for your questions. Thank you very much.